Good afternoon, High-10 George Realty. We're lucky to have people in the room, including Peter Cam. We are doing session one of the AIR purchase agreement. And I always like to do a little disclaimer. If you have never worked an AIR contract or don't have a lot of experience, I highly recommend that you find a mentor / partner that has the experience in these types of contracts. Once you read them and you get familiar, they're easier to work. But if it would be your first round and you're not super experienced on them, please consider finding a mentor or a partner, okay? And as always, we are always here to answer your questions. So, go ahead.
Yeah, I just curious, this form that we can pull out from the zip form?
No, you have to purchase it. So Peter can go over that. I'm going to, how you purchase it. I'm going to start sharing. Hold on.
That's good. That's good. I'll show you later on.
Yeah.
You have to purchase it to the.
They're purchasing.
Yeah.
Really? Oh, wow.
It's an extra charge.
Wow, see, I thought before we this.
Okay, so remember that these Paxton just brought up, these are purchased forms. You have to pay for them annually. I can't give you the mechanics of how to pull them into your car, but they do pull into your car, okay? So I'm going to start off. I'm not going to go over the agency disclosure, but let's remember to always have an agency disclosure with any offer or lease agreement as well, okay? So I will not be addressing the agency disclosure. You should already be very familiar with this. It's going to look like the agency disclosure from CAR. So let's start on the purchase agreement. If you see me looking down, it's because I've made 8 pages worth of notes. I want to make sure that this is a training that you can use and refer back to. So this date here, just like most of our other contracts, is for, reference purposes only. It's truly for reference purposes. It's when you type the contract up. Okay, so let me back up one step because I think it was Paxton before we were going into this training said, how about LOI training? Well, there's 2 schools of thoughts on that. Letter of intents are good. On a purchase agreement, if you want to just cut to the chase and make an offer, you can do that too. Letter of intents are non-binding if it's a hot property. Maybe we just did that. We went straight into a purchase, offer. We did not send an LOI. We hit the offer immediately because it was something the buyer really wanted. Okay, so you can structure either with a non-binding LOI first. If you feel like it's something that the buyer wants to jump on quickly, you certainly can go right into an offer, and then the seller will counter whatever points necessary, just like standard contract work, okay?
Sure, but excuse me, you usually just in case you show something, send a form first to the.
Well, you have to do are you talking about the equivalent of a BRBC? You still have to have a broker's commission agreement. AIR has its own form. I just didn't pull it in.
Okay.
But please do that.
Okay.
But if I recommend going LOI or contract, if it's a property that somebody's really interested in, I probably would hit the offer, because I don't know how many people are looking at it if you feel it's competitive. Okay. So this is a reference only 1.1. You are going to insert the buyer. And if the buyer is an LLC, make sure you identify the state that the LLC was formed. For instance, Michelle Olson LLC, a California limited liability company. So you want to make sure that you're being specific on what type of entity it is. If the buyer is a trust, for instance, make sure you say who the trustee is and identify they are acting as the trustee. You can look up corporations and LLC on Secretary of State. You can also ask the buyer for some information so you can see that the buyer, in this case, has the authority to sign the agreement for the entity. And all owners would need to sign this, okay? Or in the case of an LLC, excuse me, all parties would need to sign. In the case of LLCs, there's probably a managing member. Sometimes in corporations, there's going to be two people signing. So just make sure you understand the structure. Peter's probably more, better on that to advise, but I just want to bring that up to you. Make sure that you're doing that. So you see here, you have, it all automatically defaults to a 30-day close of escrow, or you insert the days. Now remember, on an AIR contract, these are not passive removals of, these are passive, meaning there's no, I'm removing contingencies forms, right? In AIR. So if you look at this, it says 30 days or whatever days you insert after the waiver or satisfactions of the buyer's contingencies. So keep that in mind when you're inserting days. Okay, so let's say you anticipate a 90-day close, right? But then you're going to look in your other contingencies. Some of those run for 30 days, right? So maybe you only want to insert a 60, but make sure you understand and be very tight on watching your contingency lines. And I'll keep reminding that, because if you don't say anything on a contingency, then you've accepted it, okay? On these, and there's a form to unaccept, a contingency, and I'll show you that at the end. So you're going to fill all of this out. The escrow holder is inserted here. Who's going to hold the escrow? Please put their phone number. Now, we don't need to put up here Michelle Olson LLC, and or assignee. Why? Because if you look right here, the buyer shall have the right to assign the buyer's rights here under. But remind the buyer that that does not relieve that buyer of their obligations under this agreement. Okay, so they can assign it, but they're not relieved of the obligations unless something was structured in the contract. Most sellers are probably going to want to make them obligated as well.
And that assignee, Michelle, sorry, can we remove that? If I'm a listing agent, can I count it back and I tell them, remove the assignee or give me the names of the owners? Because I don't want them to be changing the names during the transaction. Can we do that, Peter?
What's this come back again?
Like for instance, residential, they put.
And or assignee.
Or assignee, but in experience, they're selling that thing to other people. And we get a hook over there because we don't know who the assignee is. My question over here is, if I'm the listing agent and I receive an offer that, it's okay for me to count it back and it says, no assignee allows, must put names of the
You
buyer.
do anything you want, but
Exactly.
usually you would allow SME.
Really?
Yeah,
I would put the buyer to decide the assignee upon opening of escrow.
Yeah, give them a
like that.
use.
Or you have
Yeah, so
17 days to identify the SME.
Yeah, give them days. And also remember, if it's an individual like Michelle Olson and I'm assigning to my wholly owned entity, that's okay. You would still probably need to let escrow know and have a paper drawn, but that's not gonna, muck anything up, I don't think, Peter, right? Because it's wholly owned by me, okay? So
And another thing about the living trust, okay, living trust is not a legal entity where you can own something. So you have to say that, so and so is trustee of the whatever.
the full trust name.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't
But if the
know.
LLC, you can do that. You can do the whatever, just the LLC. You don't have to disclose the manager's name, because the LLC is a legal entity where they can own their property. But the living trust, you cannot own the living trust by you can not own the property by the living trust.
So he's saying an entity such as an LLC has ownership of the property.
Yeah.
A living trust does not.
Right.
So that's the difference. That's what he means.
Right.
Yeah.
How many property was owned? by living
Yeah,
trust.
by the trustee of the living trust.
Yeah, not just the
Not
trust,
just the
right?
trust.
Okay.
But the trust alone does not have the legal authority to own the property.
That's the
Process
point.
the
Yeah,
paperwork.
that's a.
Who is that person on charge to
Yeah,
sign?
yeah, yeah.
I need to know who's that. Yeah,
Right,
okay,
right.
okay.
That's why, even in the reporting, you know, in the assessor's office, you have to identify the trustee. You cannot say that, oh, granted to the certain trust. You have to say granted to, Alex, trustee of the Alex Living Trust.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
So we're at the 2.1. This is that the subject property, this offer consists of insert a brief physical description. So you can assert something like a 2-story office building, warehouse located at. What in the training that I learned, listening to the AIR attorneys, the authors of a lot of the contract, is don't make the description about the square footage. Why? Because assessor's data could be different from an appraisal, and your own measurements may be different. So you may have 3 sets of measurements. The buyer can go ahead and measure the property, but on the description, they recommend you do not make this contract about a set square footage because it is not verified. So don't make that a problem at the very beginning. If you do reference in a contract, though, one of the pro tips they gave, if you feel like you must, but we don't recommend it in the description, make sure you provide who provided that data, where you got that square footage. We do not recommend it, though. You could put something simple like a warehouse located at and use the address again. You can certainly do that. And this property is located in the county of, and then here's the street address. Even if I reference it here, I can still restate it here because I'm saying 2-story office building located at 660 West Huntington Drive, Arcadia, California, right? So don't make it about that square footage.
But we add like a parcel number, do we have it?
Yes, it's down here. So
Oh, okay.
the legal description is here.
Oh, yeah.
Now, the legal description, remember, is provided by the title company.
Correct.
So if you don't have it, or you're thinking, oh, maybe what I'm looking up isn't what is going to be updated on the title company, this is still a valid contract. The title company that is selected down here on 2.2 will provide the legal description. You can put the APN in right underneath, but if you look at 2.2, it's going to tell you that the title company will provide the legal description and who is the title company under 2.2. You can insert that here. Okay.
Right.
So there's just a little bit difference of where to put things, but it's very flowable once you look at it. So 2.3, you know, they include the building or property is going to include all the fixtures as part of the real estate. If you have, you know, fixtures, HVAC, things of that nature, if you have something else that you want to include in the property, make sure to fill it in after and. They left you space for that. So some buildings will have the fire sprinkler monitors. Sometimes you're not going to know who owns it. If it's leased or owned by the seller, you could certainly ask the other agent, or you can simply check ownership will be determined during escrow. Or if you know for a fact there's no fire sprinkler monitor, you can certainly check that box. But if it's leased, you know, you're going to want to know that so you can be starting early to review the lease agreement on that particular
And fire sprinkler not owned by the seller.
the monitoring system. They sometimes lease them. I don't know how that works. I've never seen I don't know if you have, but I've never seen a monitoring system lease agreement. So I don't know, but they're saying that that can be something that happens. So any personal property is not included. If you look at 2.5, there is there's a statement here saying personal property is not included. And if you want to make something exempt from going with the sale, then you need to put it in here. You need to exclude that from the cell. So this is pretty simple. If you really look at this, they've laid it out pretty nice. It's just in a little bit different order. And this is different here. So the purchase price, you're going to put the full purchase price here, right? Anything below this that's not applicable because there's some seller financing clauses, you can strike that out. But look at 3.1a. That is a little bit different because here you're going to have the cash down payment, including the deposit. So you're going to say, wait a minute, I don't want that as part of liquidated damages. You know that commercial contracts do not have a cap like residential does at 3%. So once we get into session 2, you'll see there's a liquidated damages paragraph in this contract. You're going to assert the amount that's applicable to the liquidated damages. Because when you first start working these contracts, you're like, whoa, that's a lot of money. That's, that could be liquidated damages. No, you have another paragraph at the kind of the back of the contract where you're going to tell the seller what you're offering, what amount, if any, of liquidated damages, okay? So here on A, it's all of the cash down payment. If you have a new loan, you're going to insert that amount here. So here's where I would normally be doing the crossing, some of these financing, first note, second note. So normally I'm only working with these 3 items here, but that's up to how the deal is structured. There are some where the seller will finance. If not, you can go ahead and strike them. The total purchase price, this doesn't calc down for you. So you have to calculate it yourself and insert the number, okay? Okay, so we're going to go to the deposits here. They have a section where the buyer can deliver a check to the broker. We don't want that. That needs to go straight to escrow, not to us. We don't hold any, we don't have I guess it's a trust account. We're not doing that. We don't even want to touch it. Let it go straight into escrow. So you're going to check the box here within 2 business days, or you can insert whatever days that maybe your client needs to get some money moved around. Maybe you need a little bit more time, but you can insert whatever days here and give it to the have them give it to the escrow company. And in this contract, they're allowed to pay by check, so that can be worked out with the escrow company. And you're going to tell them both parties in this agreement shall deliver to escrow holder a check. See, it's saying check. Put that amount here. Okay. So additional deposits, usually these are, if you're getting something, you're giving something, sometimes the seller's going to want you to up your deposit or something. But if you've already put your liquidated damage amount in the paragraph, you're covered unless they've countered it. So they can make you up the deposit, but your liquidated damage amount would stay stable as to what was in that paragraph or counter offer there too. Okay. So 5 business days, the buyer shall deposit additional sum if that's applicable. They're going to provide 5 business days after the contingencies are removed an additional sum. So those are only if they're applicable. Otherwise, they're going to remain blank. Escrow holder shall deposit the funds that are required, and they shall be deposited by escrow in an interest-bearing account. So you can counter that out if the buyer says, that's a lot, I don't need it. We do have buyers that do counter that out, but just so you know, it's an interest-bearing account, and the only way that they can set that interest-bearing account up with your deposit is that you provide the buyer's federal tax ID number. So if they want that and you know it out the gate, try to get that number in there right away, okay? So that escrow can act on that. If you're dealing with an escrow company that you're not sure if they deal with a lot of AIR purchase agreements, it's perfectly fine to say, please look at paragraph blah, 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 whatever you think they need to know, especially 4.3, they're going to need to know about 4.4. So 5 days after the escrow holder receives the funds described above, then the escrow holder is gonna release $100 from the funds of the buyer to the seller, and that's for independent consideration for the seller's execution of this agreement and granting of the contingency periods to the buyer. So if this goes sideways and the buyer doesn't close, then that $100 is non-refundable. If they close, it's part of the down payment. So they did that because there was a lawsuit where a seller went all the way to court and said, I didn't have any consideration for the contingencies because there was some contingency battle. I don't really know the lawsuit well. This is just what they were mentioning. So in order to head that off, they put the $100 in. I don't recommend you strike that, by the way. Leave it.
Michelle, let me take a little back. The federal tax identification number, isn't it a private number for the owner? It's like the social security for us, or?
No, if it's a social, yeah, don't type it on the contract. You could provide that to escrow yourself, but
By the tax ID number?
tax ID is like
Isn't it
for
a private number?
LLCs and corporations, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that wouldn't be that private. That should be okay, but I wouldn't put a social on there.
No.
Yeah, if it is a social, make sure you're providing it privately to escrow,
Gotcha.
or better yet, have your buyer do it.
What's the purpose of these the $100?
The purpose is that the buyer has provided consideration
Yeah, just
to the seller.
for trouble opening up by escrow, that's what. Now, in case that they have to refund the liquidated damage. You know, for the deposit. So in other words, for any reason that the seller or the deal doesn't go through, they want the buyer to pay the $100 just for opening up escrow.
Yeah, but $100 to pay, nothing, people.
Well, at least what's less than nothing, right?
Yeah,
Can
this,
they increase it, like, count it back and say,
You could counter it.
$500 for instance, stuff like that?
you could, but this is just a placeholder, really. It's so nominal that because of that one court battle, they decided to put it in so the seller had consideration within 5 days of receiving that deposit from the buyer. It's very nominal, and the only reason is to show they had consideration. And we do check the checks, by the way.
Okay.
Even though we took the check, stapled it in the file, called escrow, hey, we didn't cash it, we're gonna give it back, because we were closing. So,
Gotcha.
yeah, uh-huh.
I have a question on 4.3 about the interest bearing account. Does that mean like a regular account, or what do they mean by that?
It's
What's that?
interest bearing.
4.3, where it
Oh,
says
interest bearing?
interest bearing account.
Oh, the escrow.
The escrow sets it up.
The
Yeah,
escrow
the
setup.
escrow will the escrow to trust account is an interest bearing account.
So escrow has two kinds of account. One is interest bearing account, and one is no interest bearing.
Yeah, the one that trust account, they always have the interest bearing account. For the escrow,
Trust accounts.
And you can argue what kind of interest.
you cannot argue, but they're supposed to give you back the interest that they accrue on that account.
When the property is big.
So you can either,
Yeah.
yeah, that's right. You can keep it in, or you can say not applicable. You can counter that if your buyer says, I don't want to deal with that. But, let escrow figure it out. But do point these paragraphs out to them, because if they're not having, tons of AIR, you could overlook something, okay? So if you look at 4.5, once all buyer contingency periods are passed, then the liquidated damage amount back in that further back paragraph that you put in or that was countered becomes non-refundable. So that's what 4.5 is about. Okay. And remember, you don't have a form to remove all contingencies. You got to be really tight on your own lines. And we'll be going through the contingencies today. So very important on 5.1, don't forget to fill this out if you have a loan. So the offer is contingent upon the buyer obtaining from a insurance company, financial institution, etc., a sum equal to at least how much percentage of the loan? Like, are you putting 30% down, so you need a 70% loan? Whatever the percentile is, put it in this box. Don't leave that out if you have a loan. Okay, because you're gonna need a loan of 70% if you're only putting 30, etc. Okay, so make sure that you fill out 5.1 because that's really easy to miss.
I'm sorry, Michelle, so if you put 70% over here, so that is the amount of money that,
Whatever the percentile is that the person's borrowing
yes,
on the loan.
You should
But
already
that's the
get the
plan.
loan pre-approval.
Yeah, you'll have it. The lender will
Right.
tell you.
but my question is, if that business goes south and it doesn't close, so that percentage is the one that the sellers can say, okay, I will hold it because you didn't.
No, this is a percentile of how much are you financing?
Oh,
Yeah.
finance-
How much
and I-
percent
yeah,
of the,
Financing.
yeah,
Financing, yeah, yes, yeah, got it.
okay.
And it says at least, that means at least that's the lowest amount that the lender would lend it to you.
Mm-hmm,
Okay,
yeah.
Buyer, I should say.
this is the low.
And I will always shoot a little bit high. I will shoot a little bit high on that percentage,
Yeah.
just as a cushion. I don't know why, I just want a little cushion, but I shoot high a little bit. Not crazy, but a little bit. So this is another very important paragraph. Let's look at 5.2 together. It's very important. So if the buyer fails to notify the broker and the escrow holder and the seller, so they have 3 notifications there, in writing within X amount of days following the date of agreement, that they're not able to get the loan, they need to do that. It shall be conclusively presumed that the buyer has either obtained the loan or has waived the new loan contingency. So you need to let them know if you cannot get the loan. See, it says that the new loan that you can't get it. So put some days in there, give yourself some breathing room on the loan, because as we know, those may take a little longer, right?
Where's
So,
the loan? Yes.
I don't know if you want 60 days. Peter could probably recommend more on a commercial closing, but give yourself some days, talk to the lender. Okay? So, and then we're gonna hit to, I'm sorry, I have to look down at my notes because it's easier for me to read. So on 5.3, if the buyer notifies all parties that they're supposed to, that the buyer did not obtain the new loan, then this agreement is terminated and the buyer is entitled to the prompt return of their deposit plus the interest they earned if that was applicable, if you didn't strike that, less any escrow cancellation fees, okay? So it's a good protectant, but these are really small, so you want to make sure that you don't miss those, okay? Very important boxes. Seller financing, you can strike whatever is not applicable on this. I don't go into seller financing too much because I'm not, there's the handout there. We're very well versed on it, but if you are doing seller financing, you can get some help from escrow, from a lender, but I'm not going to cover it too much because I am not well versed on seller financing. So you get the information from the seller, run it through escrow, and then, see how that works. So I'm not going to even explain it because I get confused on it. So if you look on hang on, let me flip over to 6.2 here, or 6.4. So California law does not allow deficiency judgments on seller financing. If the buyer defaults on the loan, this is for seller financing, then the seller's sole remedy is to foreclose on the property. Okay, so they have a huge warning. Peter probably knows legally better what that means.
Yeah, for the residential sales, 4 units or less is governed by the California statutes. And it will forbid the deficiency judgment on all the money purchase loans and also the seller finance loans. You understand what I mean? It means that the money that you use to purchase the residential unit, okay, will not be subject to any deficiency judgment. In other words, if you sell the property, if you foreclose the property and the property got less money than what you have financed, you cannot chase after
Oh,
the buyer for
Right.
additional money.
it's
Like
very
we do
For
short
the
sale,
commercial,
like short
commercial,
sale notes, are we talking about like short sale notes that we used to tell them? Hey, the property, I bought it at this price, but now the value is less,
yeah.
the short sale that we used to call. That is not,
The short sale, the short sale is a different thing. Short sale that you promise to forgive that.
yes, correct.
But the financing, if you foreclose the property for residential, you cannot still go after for the efficiency judgment. Yeah.
Gotcha.
But for commercial, you could.
Mhm.
Commercial, you know,
Commercial,
maybe
you could.
commercial buildings and the land or, yeah. Maybe commercial units, you can go after the borrower for efficiency.
Okay. Taking notes, no?
So on 6.5, so this is how the seller's gonna check. It says the seller obligation to provide the financing is contingent upon the seller's reasonable approval of the buyer's financial condition. So the buyer should provide the seller required documents within 10 days following the date of the agreement. If you want to amend it to shorter, so you can go ahead, that's up to you. And then after that, the seller has 10 days to review the documents and satisfy self. And the seller shall notify escrow whether or not the buyer is approved for their obligation for financing. If the seller does not approve the buyer, then the buyer has 10 days of the written notice from the seller to terminate the agreement, or they can move forward without seller financing. Okay. So they tried to cover everything in here, and I think they've done a good job. So real estate brokers, again, this is important that you get this right. Fill out everything properly here with who you're representing, you know, license numbers, our brokerage number. Remember, for commercial, we are Coldwell Banker Commercial George Realty. And it's the same DRE number 01121690. Okay.
Michelle, excuse me, Peter, in this situation, it's like the sellers are carrying a second loan on the
Yeah, second trustee,
second trustee.
yeah, that's called the seller finance.
Seller finance.
Mhm.
So so this is one that escrow needs to pay attention to on section 8.2. As soon as practical, after receipt of the agreement and all the applicable fully executed counteroffers, you know, that are received by the escrow, then the escrow holder is going to ascertain the date of the agreement. Remember, the date prepared is just reference. Once escrow has their hands on all fully executed agreement, they're going to ascertain what that date of agreement is. And it says that, you know, the agreement is reached when the last offer or counteroffer has been accepted and delivered to all parties. And the delivery of the final counteroffer to all the parties is extremely important. So make sure that every counteroffer in line, the offer and any counteroffers that you've delivered them, because we want to get that date of agreement going quickly. Okay. So on 8.3, let me drop down. So escrow holder will prepare the escrow instructions. Now, if there's any conflict between state law where the property is located and this purchase agreement, then the state law is going to prevail on this one. Okay. And that's in 8.3. So 8.4, this is subject to satisfaction of the contingencies in this agreement. Then the escrow holder shall close the escrow and do the recording and disbursements and stuff for closing. So these are pretty standard things. 8.5. The buyer and seller. Now this you may want to pay a little attention to. I think it's okay for Southern California, but buyer and seller shall each pay half of the escrow holder charges and the seller is paying for the recording fee, transfer taxes. Seller pays for standard coverage of the owner's portion of the title insurance. So if any of these are you want to counter or change around, make sure you're paying attention to 8.5, okay? You know, this is pretty standard, but if you need to counter any of that because the buyer is trying to be, you know, more aggressive and getting the deal, maybe they're paying for something. So make sure that you're paying attention to 8.5. So
Counter refer to 8.5, right?
no, if only if you want to amend the paragraph.
Yes. Any counter.
Yeah, yeah. So here's another E for escrow. Escrow holder needs to verify that all buyer contingencies have been satisfied or waived prior to closing. So what's the escrow officer going to do? They're going to shoot an email out, copying all parties and agents and say, buyer, are all the contingencies satisfied or waived? They do need to do that as part of the file. That is a escrow holder responsibility. So they have some additional steps on this AIR, okay? So make sure that when you're helping your escrow officer, just so it's smooth for everybody, they might know this, but I would just point it out. So on 8.7, it's going through the steps of if this transaction is terminated for non-satisfaction and non-waiver, the buyer's not going to waive the contingencies. Then neither party has a liability one to the other. The reminder that the buyer does need to notify all parties in escrow holder in writing that they do not approve nor waive the contingencies. So if that happens, there is a form, and I did pull it up into this session just to show you. It's very simple. And so if the buyer cancels, the buyer gets his deposits back, less the title and escrow cancellation fees, and less the $100 consideration. They're not going to get that back because they're not closing, okay? So that doesn't come back. All right. So just keep that in mind on that one. And 8.8, the closing occurs, you know, of course, on the expected closing case date, which escrow helped with the start date, so you can count from there. But if escrow is not in position to close and all parties are not mutually agreeing to extend the close date, then the escrow may be terminated only after the non-complying, like let's say the buyer's not removing a contingency, party is given a 5-day notice to cure. So you can't just rip it out from under them, cancel. You know, it's like with any other contract, there are some steps to protect everybody. So an 8.9, if you do cancel by the buyer in the event of termination, buyer and seller are still responsible if there were any escrow fee or other costs associated, okay? So let's move down here. So we're going to get into the contingencies. So this is the ones you're going to want to watch. You could, you know, just print these, keep track on your file. So if these are laid out pretty nice. I want to caution you, there's 2 disclosures. Mainly the property information sheet and the seller's mandatory disclosure statement. These contingencies will not start running in most cases, and it'll be explicit in each contingency period until the property information sheet is turned in to the buyer and you've sent it to them. So make sure that you're not holding back. They're simple. I have them attached to this training because I want to show you these are not hard forms for the seller to fill out. Best you get these right away because when you're managing this for your seller, they're relying on you and you want those contingencies starting ASAP, okay? So you want to give it to them. When you open escrow, give them the 2 disclosures, okay? So if you look at all these, you can amend these. Physical inspection, buyer has 10 days. Maybe that's not enough. Maybe you need 20. So make sure you're going through each one of these and amending them as you see fit. Hazardous substance conditions report, buyer has 30 days. And the seller is not required to provide buyer this report. However, if the seller has one in its possession, they may want to provide it, okay? So you just come through and look at, what happened to my size? Okay, so 9.1 hazardous substance 9.1D, soil inspection. Buyer, it defaults to 30 days. If you think you need more, then amend it. Following the receipt of the property information sheet. So you need to make sure you're giving these out or the date of the agreement, whichever is later. Seller recommends that the buyer obtain a soil test report, which shall be paid for by the buyer in this instance, okay? So if you need to amend that in any way, make sure. So this test, because I had to look it up, is for for compaction and type of soil that exists on the property, because I wasn't sure what that meant. So if you drop down to 9.1E, government approvals, the buyer has 30 days, or you can amend it following the date of agreement to satisfy itself regarding permits from government agencies, things of that nature. There is a note. At a minimum, the buyer should verify that the property is not in violation of any codes, okay, or ordinances. If the usage for a certain type of use was approved in the past, it doesn't mean it's approved now. So they really need to check that.
Michelle, can I make you a question with that?
Yeah,
If the soil, for instance, it was a mechanic place or gas station,
it's gonna be phase 1 and then most likely phase 2.
and that would take long time to get this.
Yeah, it takes, well, phase 1 you could probably get quick. I don't know how long the corrections are, but if you're selling that kind of property, make sure in the contract or, there's addendums you can attach that you stipulate who you want to pay.
Okay.
Yeah, because if it's especially dry cleaners, gas stations, if you're gonna go to phase 1, sometimes they're clean, sometimes not. You'll need to go to phase 2, but if you already know that, make sure you're outlining it in your offer that you'd like the seller to provide those. That's up to the seller. That's negotiation.
Gotcha.
60 days.
60 days on phase 2?
I went to the 60.
Excuse me, Michelle. So who pays for phase 1 and phase 2?
Fine.
Buyer.
Buyer?
Unless, like I said, you amend it on your addendum and you ask the seller to pay in your offer, or if you were doing an LOI, but they're probably going to push back, but that's up to you. That's negotiation, right?
Mhm.
So I don't know if there's any standard of who pays.
Due diligence are done by, pay for buyer.
Yeah,
Yeah, so you pay, including the physical inspection before.
You usually pay for.
But
the
even
buyer.
though the seller knows that, it's, let's say, a mechanic place for many years, so they're doing the phase 1. You already know it's a mechanic place, that even the seller,
Mechanical place, you mean?
no,
mechanic shop.
Mechanic shop.
Oh,
Mechanic shop, I'm sorry.
Okay.
yeah. So as an owner, I'm a mechanic shop, I know that contamination of the land. So didn't the sellers have the obligation to do a study? No.
No.
The buyer.
So the buyer has the obligation, right?
Yeah.
They're the ones that have to.
Well, they're not obligated, it's negotiable.
That's
It
negotiable.
is, like Michelle says, if the seller's getting a fantastic deal and the net sheet comes out, I'll pay for it, I'm the seller.
That's, for me, I would think the seller would be responsible for all that.
Well, no, it's negotiable.
No.
Hey, Michelle?
Yeah.
If you're getting a killer deal.
Okay.
Jimmy, he bought the property 50,000, now it's $2-3 million, is it not gonna fall over phase 1 or phase 2?
So 9.1F is another one we need to be really watching, and we need to advise our, not only escrow, but our title company. So this particular contract is requiring a title commitment unless you amend it to a preliminary title report. So a title commitment takes longer to get. So this one goes for 10 days. You're not going to have time in 10 days, because I think last time we ordered, we were almost at 15 or 16 days. So you need to amend that if you're really asking for a title commitment.
What
Okay.
is the title?
I never heard of that.
It's a deeper dive, because I didn't know either.
Prelim?
It's deeper than a prelim. I
Okay.
don't know, right? They
Okay.
go deeper on the property. And so this by default is requiring a title commitment, but we've had an escrow office, they still ordered a prelim. I'm like, no, we want the title commitment. Okay, but you can have this right now. They're working on it. So unless you amend it to a preliminary title report, you need to make sure you get the commitment report.
That was 9.1?
9.1 F is in Frank.
Okay, thank you.
So 9.1 G, survey, the buyer has 30 days following receipt. Now, this is another one that's tied to something else, receipt of the title commitment or the preliminary title report if you amended it and the underlining documents, okay? So just those are the things that I'm saying, escrow, make sure you're noting on this contract the things that you need to talk to them about. And any such survey shall be prepared at buyer's discretion and expense on 9.1 G. So existing leases and tenancy statements, seller shall within 10 days, or you can amend the days following the agreement, provide the buyer and escrow with legible copies of leases and rental agreements and with the estoppel certificates. Okay, in the latest form equivalent to that published by AIR. If you're not going to use an AIR estoppel, you can amend that out. Okay, but your estoppels are already covered in 9.1 H that they need to give you that. So, and then the buyer has 10 days from receipt of all those documents to review them. So the contract does allow, like, let's say a tenant's like, I'm not gonna fill that out or sign it or whatever. So the contract does allow for the lessor to complete the estoppel on behalf of a tenant who will not provide it. And I didn't know this, but some lenders may require that the estoppel be signed by the tenant. So you need to just check and make sure,
Michelle, but what if they refuse?
I don't know.
Can sign, right?
Yeah, the lessee can, but don't get honked up on that. Just check in advance. Hey, we go, or call escrow. Hey, we got all the estoppels. There's one going to be signed by the lessor. And that was just in the training I went. That's what they said, to make sure that you're clued in on that if there's like one that, they're not signing. Okay.
Well, here you have, for the estoppel certificate, you have another provision that says the seller shall use his best effort.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Then
yeah, of
complete it,
course.
and if they don't, they refuse to do that, then, and you can have the seller complete it and then execute the estoppel certificate on behalf of the
Then
tenant.
it's up to the buyer to
Yeah,
say
so-
yay or nay,
So it's okay.
right?
So can the lender stop on us? Because that's what they were saying in that training, like they don't like that estoppel.
Yeah, they can do that.
They can in underwriting, right? Yeah, that's what they were saying. That's maybe a little too deep for this class, but it's just something to think
It's
about.
important because that's their source of their money.
Yeah, yeah. So if you look at J 9.1,
Usually in the leasing, when you lease it for the commercial tenants, the lease itself
In the
says that,
contract.
and if you don't produce the estoppel certificate, the lessor can do it for you.
yeah,
And then you have to you have to agree to it.
okay,
Yeah.
that's a good point. So owners association, if applicable, within 10 days of the date of the agreement, provide the buyer with the information on that, and then the buyer has 10 days to review the documents. If that's the case and it's going to take longer, if there is an association there, make sure you up those days, okay? Other agreements on 9.1 J, the seller needs to provide those within 10 days of the agreement with legible copies. So other agreements could include, but are not limited to, things such as maybe they have a contract for HVAC maintenance, roof maintenance, parking lot sweeping. Maybe they have a gardener, trash collection. Maybe these are things that could be canceled after escrow. But if they've executed the agreements, you do want to make sure that if it's not something you want to pay for, you have your own vendor, that they can be canceled upon close of escrow. Okay. So any kind of vendor contracts on that property, you want to make sure that they can be canceled when you close. 9.1 K, financing. That's pretty self-explanatory, existing notes. I'm not gonna go over that, that's more, assumption. Personal property, in the event that you include some, that personal property is included in the purchase, then the buyer has 10 days or amend it, to satisfy self with in regards to the condition of the property. Maybe they're buying a existing restaurant, that has the equipment and things like that. Maybe some of it's considered personal property. Seller recommends that buyer obtain a UCC1 report, Uniform Commercial Code, which shall be paid for by the buyer. So what is that? Because, I have to look this stuff up myself. So in California, the UCC1 filing, also known as a financing statement, is a legal document that they file with the Secretary of State that provides public notice of a creditor's interest in the debtor's personal property used as collateral for a secured loan or other transaction. It's essentially a lien on the collateral, giving the creditor priority in the event of debtor's default. That is a legal description. So just to try to help you understand what that may mean. Of course, you can always seek legal advice if you need it. Okay. So destruction or damage. So here, if a cost of destruction and damage exceeds $10,000 to repair or cure, if the cost exceeds $10,000, then, I'm sorry, got myself mixed up here. So there's a $10,000 cap, and if it goes over that and the seller doesn't want to repair it, then this contract can be terminated. But we all know that $10,000 in today's terms are not much money. So sometimes they recommend, if you don't want to give an out, but you're hoping there's no destruction. I haven't seen this clause used personally. I don't know if you have. It's something totally damaging where they can't sell it. So maybe don't worry about it, just let it go. But they do say that 10,000 in today's money is not much money to allow for a possible termination of the agreement, so that's something to think about. 9.10 material changes. You do need to notify a buyer if there's material changes, such as the zoning you've been updated on the zoning, you've discovered hazardous material, maybe a large tenant has moved out, there's tenants in the building. So any material change, you need to go ahead and let the buyer know. And the buyer has 10 days on that notice. So seller performance, the seller is obligated to provide all the required documents and take actions to facilitate the closing and signing the grant deed. Okay, so the brokers do not have expertise. I'm dropping down to 9.4 regarding hazardous substance on the property or neighboring properties. So the parties acknowledge that the brokers have advised all parties to consult with their own legal experts and technical experts with respect to the possible hazardous substances. So that's going to conclude the contract, but I want to get to these other forms really quick because you're going to see how easy they are. Okay, let's go here. So here's the property information sheet, and make sure you do this with the listing or very quickly thereafter if you're a listing agent. So property information, the seller just goes down and answers these questions. It's like, do you know of any material defects? If there's none, you write none. It's just like some of our car disclosures. So they're going to go down and fill this out, not you, them. And then they're going to sign it. And then once you have a buyer, you're going to provide it to the buyer. Here's the seller's mandatory disclosure statement. And you see it's not for use for residential sales, okay? So here, you can click the box. You can use My NHD natural hazard, or you can click and put your own natural hazard report company in there. Make sure you're getting that. Always ask for the additional, the environmental, which only costs about $20 more. Do that. And then they're going to simply go down, the seller, and they're going to check the appropriate boxes. If they have an NHD company they prefer, by all means, let the seller choose it. So they're just going to go down and check these boxes, okay? whatever, and then they're gonna sign it. Seller's gonna provide it to the buyer. Now, here's the notice of disapproving of contingencies. This is a very simple form. The buyer disapproves of the following contingencies. It's lining them all out for you, and you can check all that apply. Or there's some additional things the buyer can request. The buyer requests the seller to complete as appropriate as seller's costs make the following repairs. You can check that box. It's just like a request for repair. But here you see they've married the contingencies with the request for repair. They also have a line item in here where you can ask for a price reduction. And also the extension of the closing is here. Okay, so this form is very important. It's very simple to use, and you can use it more than one time. So that concludes today. We're only going to do hour long on this because I think it's too much if you do too many. So are there any questions or comments?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so you know how with the new laws, when you have a residential buyer, the buyer has to pay you. Now with commercial, is that gonna happen too, where the buyer's gonna change it, pay you
Yeah,
They
the
do.
commission, or?
yes.
Or the seller can pay the commission,
The,
with no commercial.
the same thing.
Same.
Same thing, yeah, you still have to ask the buyer, how much of commission,
Mm-hmm.
you will allow the buyer's broker to have. And then you have to, the purchase agreement and present it to the seller and ask the seller for a certain amount of, commission for the buyer's agent.
Right.
So then, do we have a form for commercial? Where it's gonna tell the buyer that he has to pay, just like we do?
Mhm.
commercial? Okay.
It's interchangeable on car, right? Because you're checking boxes that are residential, commercial, industrial. On AIR,
Oh.
they have a specific form for the purchase agreements, but just like Peter said, it's kind of think of it as the same thing. There's a little box at the back of this contract where you can request your commission, and they will use that box as the commission agreement. So you always want to fill it in. But it's going to require, let's say, the full commission of 5%, and then it shows the split out of 2.5 and 2.5. That's the way that little commission agreement works at the back. If you have another written agreement, you don't have to fill it out, but always, be very mindful. Make sure you have a written agreement if you leave that blank. Make sure you're taking care of yourself. But we'll get to all of that next week. And you'll see this contract flows very nicely. It's just a little bit different,
Peter, in commercial, I just, well, actually, my client and I, we met with the tenant, that she moved out. So we did a move in and then we did a move out. On commercial, do we have the same thing?
Commercial, yeah, you have this.
Yeah. Because, it's a deposit already, my place, the tenants have 2,500 deposit.
Right,
But the apartment was practically fine, the only thing it needs to be clean, so she says, just hire someone, is gonna charge $250. That's fine for me, so they're gonna return me $22.50. My question is, a commercial, if you go over there and do that, like the move out and the tenants did alterations without know
I'm not sure it will, apply to the commercial, but residential, definitely, yeah, you have to.
but yeah, commercial, I mean, residential, yes, like,
Yeah, yeah.
that's what I'm talking.
If
You
you
rent a
did
place-
alterations, though, there's a clause that says it's at the landlord's discretion or lessor. They can either allow you to leave it or make you tear it out and restore it to how it was delivered. So you have to be careful when you're leasing to know what you're looking for in the contract and to make sure that everybody's in agreement with them, because we have seen tear outs where people weren't happy to be tearing out.
Right.
And then, right? And
Yeah.
it's very expensive. And then sometimes the landlord's in love with everything they did, so no problem. But don't take that chance. And that's why I want to say again, and me and Peter talk about this a lot. If you don't have a lot of technical experience, especially on AIR contracts or commercial in general, find a mentor, find a partner, ask us before you execute on something that you really aren't sure about. Because these things are all embedded in these contracts, but you really have to be going line by line to know where to look, and we're happy to help.
And in commercial, they always say that what's the responsibility, the tenant will
Yeah.
vacate
Mhm.
the premises, you have to, for all the trade fixtures, they can remove, but for, not the trade fixture, they have to leave it there. And then we put it, we store the section level.
Now, do they have a deposit like they do over there?
Yeah, yeah, the deposit, and it's not limited to,
Okay.
to 2 months, it can be 3 months, 4 months. For the commercial.
Yeah, commercial, yeah.
Thank you all for attending on Zoom. I'm gonna cut this recording. Thank you all in the room. Until next week, have a great weekend, and we'll conclude this contract next week.
Okay.